Okay, well, welcome everyone. Pheng here, he, him, his with the Metamasculine Folks Network out of Menace Peacemakers. Continuing our conversations at the kitchen table with a group of men from different communities across the state of Minnesota on navigating masculinity and manhood, striving to be healthy versions of ourselves, and what does that really mean and look like in the context of current events and current issues that we're actually experiencing these days. That said, I wanted to make sure I also welcome Chris into the space. As always, appreciative of him jumping in and having these conversations with us. So welcome him back again with us. And as always, appreciative of Roderic and Serrano. We are missing Sean today in Austin. So for those of you who are participating on Facebook with us at this moment, definitely see if you can chime in and share, and he will do his best, Sean will do his best to relay those messages to us into this conversation as well. And then I am going to let the others quickly introduce themselves too, and I'll go forward on what we are going to be talking about today.
Hi, Roderic, he, him, his, dialing in from Golden Valley, Minnesota, which is just outside of, well, it's just part of North Minneapolis, but you wouldn't know it.
Hello, my name is Serrano Robinson. I use he, him, his pronouns, zooming out of Duluth today.
Yeah, hey, my name is Chris Godsey. I also use he, him pronouns, and I also am in Duluth, covering Duluth from multiple neighborhoods today.
Am I true? Would I be right to suggest that everybody in Duluth knows everyone else?
You wouldn't be wrong.
That's a good answer.
Like,
that's a good answer.
It's like half a degree of separation. You can go through life in Duluth thinking you have separate social circles, and then you meet one person that it's like playing Minesweeper in the old days. You click on that one person, and all of a sudden you realize those social circles haven't been separate at all. You just hadn't seen them all in the same place.
And then I wanted to say like, no, but I also go to places and play the game of like, am I going to see somebody that I know today? And it always like, you know, you always see somebody you know. So I think that was a good answer, Chris. Thank you.
Very cool. I think that really is helpful in some ways, maybe to even to our conversations today as well too, is the knowing, right? Because in community and building community, it's really about who we're building relationships with and connecting with. And we may think that we have like very far separations, or we may not know those people, but in fact we actually do. So again, this is our 24th conversation, which is really great. Woo! We made it a whole year we started a year ago with these conversations, and we'll continue, and we hope to continue, and we hope that all of you join us as we continue to dive into these conversations and similar or same topics that may come up. Today, we really didn't have anything in particular, but really wanted to share some of the things that were happening or are happening in the state, right? Particularly in Minnesota as well. We saw that the Governor Walz had recently signed an executive order today announcing the ban of conversion therapy. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's about banning a specific practice in therapy, in terms of mental health therapy, where young LGBTQ youth or LGBTQ identified people, or people who are exploring their sexuality and their sexual orientation, go into therapy to sort of get them to be get them to be straight, basically, to what the world is, right? To the binary world. And so that is what the governor did today. On top of that, we also heard a day ago around ending the statute of limitations around sexual violence. So what that means is that what it used to be was that previous. It hasn't started yet. It'll start sometime in September. I think what Serrano shared earlier. What used to be and currently is that if there is evidence beyond DNA evidence, if there is evidence of sexual assault or sexual violence, rape, what have it, people have about 9 years or 3 years to actually report, depending on when they report the crime, right, to the police. And then the police can go investigate and then file criminal complaints into the court and do the whole charging of a person. Now, taking that limitation away, what does that mean? That means that starting sometime in September and thereafter, any survivor or a victim can come out and then be able to share their stories of what happened to them and report it to the police, right? I don't think that it's retroactive to those that have happened in the past, but moving forward, like 20, 30 years from now, if somebody were to have experienced sexual violence, being raped or some other form of sexual violence, then 20 years from now, they can actually report that to the police. In particular, it has been daunting to survivors who are children when sexual violence have happened to them. And then they get to a place where they're much more older and they're ready to tell their stories, right? Then they haven't reported it to the police and they want justice in that kind of a way. And so I think that that's something that we wanted to mention here was these two very big news that are happening and that is happening in the state with everybody. And the other thing is that there's an atmosphere, and I know Chris can talk more about this too, is that there's an atmosphere in our environment right now across the country around critical race theory and what does that all mean and the clashes with that and the tension points that people have. And I know Sean had shared earlier for those who lived in or are living up in Duluth that there was a rally on Tuesday around people pushing back on the critical race theory being taught in the Duluth area. So some of those things we'll touch on. We don't know where the conversation will go, but the conversation will go where the conversation needs to go, actually. And we also are mindful that it's summer and people are at a place of feeling, I would say, I don't want to say itch, but at a place where they want to go out and be in community with folks, right? See people, because they're feeling like the pandemic is somewhat almost over, but not quite over. There are parts of the country where people are fully vaccinated in some ways, and some parts of our country where people aren't vaccinated and the Delta variant is going. So there's a number of things that we'll be touching today. But I wanted to give this preface for those of you who are engaging in this conversation at this moment with us is send in your thoughts, share your ideas with us, and we'll engage them into the conversation. But I'm going to leave it there for my long-winded intro here and framing, and leave it to my other fellows to see what is on their hearts and minds.
Well, you know, before we went live, we talked about the fact that, like you just mentioned, whatever comes up is what we're going to talk about. And I was struck during your introduction, Pheng. I was struck by the phrase conversion therapy. I'm 50 years old. I've known of conversion therapy since I was a teenager because I was raised in a very conservative Christian family that went to churches that advocated for conversion therapy. And it never sat right with me then. And I'm grateful that in the decades since then, I've built experiences and a vocabulary to be able to say why it doesn't sit right with me. But I was really like I had a pang of something in my chest based on that word therapy. I'm early in my own therapy process, and I'm lucky to be working with a therapist who is really careful and conscientious and just brilliant and beautiful at listening. And the whole thing feels healing, and it's intended to heal. And she's very good at saying, here is the pain I see you expressing about this, that, and the other. And our job here is to help you name that and figure out what you can do about it. And when I think about what it would be like to be a kid, to get put into this process of therapy that's supposed to be healing, and be told what we're helping you heal from is damage that is inherent to who you see yourself as. Your whole view of yourself, your whole experience of the world is a wound, and we need to fix that and eradicate it. I literally can't comprehend what kind of damage that must cause immediately, and the lasting harm and pain of that. So just the insidious, evil sham of calling that process therapy just hadn't landed with the weight. It hadn't ever landed with the weight I feel about it now until you were talking about it. I think life is interesting like that. How I've always thought it was bullshit, but I never had experienced it like a bomb inside my chest before. And I just can't imagine what it's like for people who have been subjected to it, to be told, hey, we're going to help you heal. And oh, by the way, the thing you're healing from is your whole identity. It's broken and we have to fix it. That's just like, that's cause for kind of infinite grief. So didn't mean to start us on such a downer note, but that's what was there for me after your intro. I appreciate you listening.
That makes sense, because I assume like on the flip, it doesn't like help folks at all who have been through like the conversion therapy, because I can only imagine like their views of what therapy means to them now are completely different and completely like harmful too. So because I can imagine like, yeah, like you said, having to be the thing that they want to help you with is your entire identity. I don't even think like I would want to go to a regular therapist or any form of like, I wouldn't even want to hear the word therapy out loud after being through such like an experience like that. And that's like, it's weird because like that's one of the main points that I talk about with the youth that I work with. Like I work with youth that are 8 to 12, and we really talk a lot about messaging. And one of the lines that I really say is like, you know, as we're gathering together, we have to watch what we say, what our messaging is, like who it's against, because those messages literally turn into behaviors that turn into policies. And literally, this is one of them. Like I couldn't have not imagined it. Like obviously, when I say it for real, but like sometimes it kind of like startles you when you get to see it in real life too, because that's exactly what it is. It was probably started off as a message from somebody who was very harmful, didn't really care about others' feelings, didn't really care about the value or identity of people in whole, and somehow made its way with the support of other people, made its way all the way up to a damn near policy, and something now that we have to unban. So that was one of the things that I like heard of that connected with me, is like how valuable it is to work with the youth about these messaging and about how these things are really hurtful, because as they get older, they get to see like, oh no, that's actually really harmful. Like that's not something that's cool. It's not something that I'm growing up with. So that's one of the things that kind of stuck out to me, was just the relationship between me talking to the youth about how we treat each other versus like policies that literally go against identities. So they like people see it in real time, and it's definitely really sad. Like I don't agree with conversion therapy at all. Like just even the idea of it, like trying to tell somebody who they are. Like therapy is supposed to be support, and you're supposed to lead to therapy. Like therapy is something that evidently we all need because of life, but it's also a choice. And you never want to get to the point where like you don't ever want to choose having somebody to talk to because of like what you've been through. Because that's essentially what therapy really is. It's like talking to somebody who's really not connected to you at the moment, so they don't have to go home with the stuff. Literally, and just listening and being able to provide certain ins and outs and certain clarifications. So I could only imagine like how someone who has been through that type of therapy envisions therapy in general, like even the word, even the essence of it. Like I wouldn't want to sit on nobody's long couch at all and even think about talking to nobody. Like, and I guess that was the other flip side is, you know, have kids out there, like talk to them about that, about the messaging, about the things that we tell each other, about the way that we that we talk to each other, because evidently this is something that, like I said, did start off as a message. I'm only assuming, and now it's a policy that we have and had to unban.
Yeah, I think someone said earlier said things are not so disconnected. So when I think of conversion therapy, I think of that, depending on the context in terms of time, time and history. And so you have, for example, you're growing up with all these messages from the general public that you're not welcome. And then you're sent to a doctor, right, or therapist to reinforce those messages, right, and to help you unattach from the shame you already that the sort of public messaging is already giving you. So I think it's really interesting. I'm sending you to some place that's going to magnify, right, the homophobia that's like already in the water, right? And so I think that is just stunning. And I think it is not so different from critical race theory in the sense of this notion that, there are messages out there already, right, that are unhealthy, right, that critical race theory can help you sort of unpack. And people are saying, nope, the best you can get is these sort of unhelpful messages that are coming from outside. So I think they're sort of linked in the sense that they both operate inside sort of social norms and messaging that are already unhelpful. And one is magnifying, and I think the other is trying to unpack. And I think it's interesting is I don't know how the demographics work in terms of people who are advocating both of those things, but it does seem that there's a notion of what is good and what is right, and that is what's I would suggest that they don't necessarily want a different conversation from the conversation they're already having about what's right and what's good and what's healthy, right? And then that brings me to vaccines, right? Because I'm also wondering sort of, what is that, who ticks all three of those boxes, right? Who is against or who is for critical race theory, right? Who was against, who was against critical race theory, who is for conversion therapy, right? And who does not want to get vaccinated because, they're American and they should be able to do what they want, be damned other people. So it does seem, I am curious. And the last thing I said is I'm curious about how that overlaps.
Yeah, I think any even when we have these conversations, right? Because these are what we call it's a platform to have very exploratory conversations and to see where tension points may be and to see where challenges are. Folks who may be listening may feel like that we're all in agreement and moving towards one direction of thinking, right? And sort of putting on a propaganda or a directional of like, this is how you all should think. But I think that we don't have enough spaces to really allow for people to actually have exploratory conversations with one another, right? When we're thinking about building community, and I think about like organizing community and building communities to actually be to what you both were talking about earlier in terms of like Duluth, right? And having less degrees of separation and being able to actually like care about community and care about your neighbor, and going back to that sort of a place where you know your neighbor pretty well and you actually think about what's going to happen in community before you make a decision and not be thinking about just yourself. In a parallel way, I think about like that we don't have enough exploratory conversations about sexuality, right? Even though there's so much like access to and yeah, access to sex and to the act of sex and to things that we see that are related to sexuality. There's not enough like perhaps places that allow for people, and particularly to Serrano's point, for young people to really explore sexuality and what that looks like. Everybody is just operating under the premise that if you're born and you look a certain way and you have certain what the word that I'm searching for is like certain organs, if I may use that word, you know, certain sexual organs between your legs, then that means that you must identify as such and such, and therefore you must be attracted to such and such, and therefore you're going to end up in such and such relationship. And typically the assumption is a very hetero assumption, right? Meaning very binary to male and female, and men being with women and women being with men only, and nothing else beyond that exists. And so I am for one about like thinking about like if we are building community and as a man in that, and then as masculine identified person in that, what would my socialization and what would my life look like if my community or society had allowed for me to actually truly explore sexuality from a very early place and kept exploring sexuality, right? And part of that, what I say in terms of kept exploring, is because sexuality is so broad and so nuanced, and there's so many things that are a part of it. It isn't just about expressions. It isn't just about what's between your legs. It's a lot more than that, and more than who you're attracted to, right? It's much more complex than that. But I think what we've done is we've fine-tuned it and made it simpler so that as individuals and people in society, we can consume it, right? And I think that that's that's how I think about at times about pornography, is that it's made into a really consumed place to say that intercourse and sex is this simple, right? And that's actually not what it is that it's actually much more than that, you know, and much more than what people wear as well too. So I'm in this place of like, how do we move to exploration and allow for tensions to arise and be able to actually struggle through that with one another, even in the critical race theory conversations and the pushback a lot around that. But like any moment, I think people hear that you're a little bit different than them, then all of a sudden it's like, I need to defend, you know, and so how do we not get to that place of defending, but like being ready to be in open struggle with one another, you know?
Weird. It's like that false sense of like identity. You know, I don't know, I bring it back to identity because I feel like identity and value are two of the things that like when you fully encompass it is when you fully know that we all deserve it, if that makes sense. I don't believe that you can fully understand identity or value if you just believe that only you are entitled to it. When I understood identity, I understood that things may be different for people, and that's okay. That's actually true. So that's always been the weirdest thing for me, is like, I think we have a serious like identity problem. Like we act like robots. Like obviously this part can go way longer. I'm gonna try to make it short though, but we really do. We'll take a policy or a message, like some Bible shit or some scripture shit, and then we all will act like robots towards it. We really do like identity when you think about it. We really do. Like we'll literally be like, oh, I did this because he or she did it, and I have no other reason for it. It doesn't make any fucking sense. Now, the few things I'm about to say, they're probably off the book. Like, I'm tired of saying shit that's like gonna hit right in the books. Like, I'm just gonna say like exactly how I feel right now. So it's weird that we have like more sex than we have sex talk. Let's just be dead ass honest. I'm sure like even us can even come to a point where like we have more physical sex than we do have sex talks, which makes no fucking sense. There's nothing else in life besides like sex, race, gender, all the things that we know to be true. Anything else in life, if we've done it before, we're cool to talk about it, right? Like, oh, I play basketball. I'll be quick to start a fucking conversation about basketball, or anybody, right? Chris is a dope professor. He'd be quick to be in a conversation about school and those things, right? So But it's funny how the real things in life we stumble across, right? We do these funny ass, weird ass sexual windows and cool, like dumbass jokes to where we just look. It's like, just say you want sex. Sex is, there's nothing wrong with that. What the fuck is wrong with us? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. I shouldn't be telling you this as a 26-year-old person, like talking to the viewers, like it's okay. It's things that we already know about. You know, the fact that we literally have more sexual things that we do more than actual conversations with our partners completely baffles me. The identity part been lost as far as like us as a whole. Like, I don't think we render what it means to actually be happy. I think a lot of people are in that systematic like approach to where they are living by that book of what happiness means. Because as far as like seeing somebody of the same sexual orientation or different, it doesn't fucking matter. I see somebody who's having fun and actually in love. Like, I've never in my one life that has been short but long for me seen somebody who was loving each other and thought, that ain't what I'm used to in the Bible, or that ain't what I grew up with. I don't give a fuck. First of all, that's not me. It ain't. My mom taught me at a good age to mind my motherfucking business. Now, that means in book terms that everybody has an identity and we need to respect that. That's what that means. That's literally what and I'm mad that I can't scream this because people won't understand it. But it's a deep sense of like not even validating your own identity. Like, I can't, I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like I respect somebody who's like, oh yeah, I have no reason, but I don't like somebody who's gay because of this, because of that. Like, you've never actually experienced somebody, you've never actually been in the face of somebody, you never actually said that in a room full of, you know what I mean? So I think that false state of like happiness is what we do too, because it's really weird. Like, it's never like two people who are like LGBTQ are like fighting or doing something, and we're like, oh, there it is. Like, it's always when somebody's actually happy, right? It's marriage, it's kids, it's shit, nothing but beautiful shit. Nothing. Like, how can you sit there other than being in your systematic bullshit and be like, that's not right? Through all the love, through all the smile, through all the radiating fucking love, how do you say like that's not right? So I know like what I'm saying right now, like it doesn't have any book terms, but I hope it sticks. Because I just had to say it, like we really act weird as a whole. Like, we act like the most childish adults in the planet, universe, history, you know, from having actual sex but saying we can't talk about it as people, to kids actually going through sexual assault, to saying kids shouldn't be able to talk about that. I'm not a parent, right? But I know these things already. And that's why I was thinking about, like, just to switch it up, like the statute of limitations. Like, that's really powerful, because like there's things that I think about now at 26 that I'm like, oh shit, I just literally bypassed that my entire life. Like, there's literally at least 10 years of me bypassing not having a father. And that ain't nowhere near fucking even close like harmful to being sexually assaulted. So I can only imagine that when you're hurt, your mind literally, probably for the safety of yourself in that moment of survival, actually blocks out a lot of the stuff that you actually been through, how you felt about it, how you're supposed to feel about it, you know, the shame, the pride, everything that goes with it. So I'm down for not having like any years, because I know it firsthand, again, experience, identity. I know what it means to be like, oh shit, I really wasn't thinking about that, but that really, really affected me. And it wasn't me being assaulted. It was just me like dealing with the fact that I didn't have a father figure around. So I got to maneuver like that. So I can only imagine that somebody who was like, you know, physically assaulted or assaulted in general would only just block that out just for the sake of their survival in the moment in time. So I know that there's probably tons of people who are rethinking about it or re-feeling it. You know, even songs, you know, just random shit help us think about it. So it's very clear, and I'm glad that they're thinking more about the emotional well-being of people. It's very clear that, you know, scars emotionally last longer than physically. We've been knew that. You know, we could hit somebody could hit me now, and I'll be cool pain-wise, but I'll think about that for years of my life, and it will bother me until I actually access it. So I think that's a clear, like, it was a clear showing of saying, hey, we care, we're starting to care more about the human's mental and emotional well-being, because to tell somebody that it was 20 years later is completely fucked up, no matter what happened to them. If somebody can render a feeling for that many moons, then that means that that's still affecting them, and that's real life, and it's a real big issue. So yeah, thank God for that.
Serrano, when you were talking, so you might be able to see the picture of James Baldwin over my shoulder. He's not there accidentally. I try to have him on my shoulder all the time because he has been very influential in helping me think about my own thinking. And I can't come up with any of the specific quotes right now. I'm disappointed in myself for that. But he in multiple places throughout his writing career, he wrote about the general immaturity of a lot of people in the United States, and specifically white people in the United States. They're just lack of being grown-ups about what it means to be a human being. And a lot of that was, I was thinking about that. It was bouncing around in my head while you were talking, because everything you said has been reflected in my lived experience. That if you want, like Pheng alluded to this before, if you want, you can go on the internet and you can find all kinds of depictions of sexual acts. You can find all kinds of puritanical stuff about how evil certain kinds of sex are, or sex between certain people. You can find really graphic language about sexual activity, but when it comes to talking about the reality of what it means to be in a sexual relationship as a human being, to exist in a world where sex exists and is not something to inherently be ashamed of or afraid of, but to be treated with care and mindfulness because of its physical and other forms of intimacy, that just doesn't exist. And if you try to bring it into a conversation where people aren't prepared for it, for 11 years, I have co-coordinated battering intervention program groups among men who have been arrested for using violence against women. I'm always co-facilitating with a woman, and we will have group sessions where we talk about sexual respect. We'll also have group sessions where we talk about intimacy. And the moment we say intimacy in one of those rooms, it's like it turned into an 8th grade health sex ed class. Very few people know what to do. And we're not mad at that, because we're talking to people who haven't been, and it's not just men who have been arrested for using violence against women that haven't been prepared for that. A lot of adults I know wouldn't be prepared for that conversation. First of all, let's talk about intimacy. And let's both extract it from and connect it to sexual relationships. You know, what role does intimacy play in sex and vice versa? And then let's just talk about sex. That the discomfort that produces in people is indicative to me of it is connected to what Roderic was saying about critical race theory, and who wants to acknowledge what critical race theory is trying to illuminate and who doesn't. Who wants to be able to sit with a fellow human being who says, this is who I am, who wants to sit with that and engage in the complexity of it, and who wants to say, no, you're broken, you go over there and get fixed so I'm more comfortable around you. And so I'm more comfortable in the world. You can perform all that stuff in ways that come across as really evolved, but it's incredibly immature. And I have simultaneous impatience and deep compassion for it. My impatience comes from the way it hurts fellow human beings. My compassion for it comes from the fact that I don't know anyone who embodies those versions of immaturity who has really had the opportunity to look at them and be rid of them, right? If everything in your life has conditioned you to think in those ways and do those things, the damage it causes to other people cannot be ignored. But there also needs to be some grace for taking the time it requires to extract yourself from that and know a different way. And not everybody's in a place where they can engage in that patient process, right? If I'm being hurt by somebody and someone says to me, hey, you just need to be patient with that, I'm going to say, fuck that. I am not the person who needs to be patient right now. Someone else needs to work with that person. I'm getting away from them. So that's that. Yeah. The first time I read some Baldwin and he talked about people being immature, I was like, who's he think he is? Does he think he's like the maturity police? But then I read more of what he was saying and I was like, it's childish. It's a childish way of looking at things. It doesn't acknowledge the grit and the sweat and the skin and the intimacy of what it really means to be a human being. And a lot of people just have no idea what to do with those things. So they try to create a world where they don't have to acknowledge them. And well, even when it is damaging, it's just heartbreaking. Right? So that's all I got. Thanks for bringing that up and saying what you said the way you said it, Serrano.
Yeah, wow, you two. That was a lot. And you're both wrong. No. And you're both so right. I got no follow-up. So no, wow. I just need to say I appreciate it. That what you guys brought. And I do think that as men trying to be healthier, we do need to keep working on how to be curious, right? And how to be contextually responsible to the things we cause, right? Wow, that just thanks a lot for what you guys said.
I can't help but think, to piggyback off of what you both shared, but to what Chris also shared is like, there's a sense of courageousness to being vulnerable, and immaturity doesn't allow you to get to that place. I think the immature ways of like allows you to actually like get to the place of perhaps arrogance and perhaps ignorance. And how do we get to the place where, to Rogeric's point there, where we can continue to be curious and vulnerable, and particularly as men, I think it's really important, and masculine identified folks, to say, hey, let me unlayer some of these things, right? Some of these things, what I mean by that is like things that I am told or I thought was true, but may not in fact be true, or what I thought was right, but may not in fact be right, right? I oftentimes more in therapy settings when I do therapy with people and in that therapeutic journey with people as a mental health practitioner with folks, when people bring up and they put value on and they attach a value, meaning like a positive or a negative value or a right or a wrong value to certain things, I sort of deconstruct that with them to move them away from that, right? Because what may be right to me may not be right to others, and what may be true to me may not be true to others. So how, when we take away that value, just for example, around power, right? It's interesting to think about power, and I think Ellen Pence said it really well about power being very neutral, right? But I think the way that, and the way that we, and some of us, you know, may have think and thought about power is in very negative terms because of the way in which we have been relating to it and the way in which it has been impacting our lives, or my life in particular, in terms of power with regards to like what Serrano was talking about, the institutionalized powers and practices of like, hey, we're going to institute these things and meet these things, the law of the land, like that you have to do these things, or these are the ways in which people have to move and behave in their life, right? And if they don't, then there's certain consequences that are attached to it, like very institutionalized consequences, because there's like enforcement on that, whether it be through the police or whether through other mechanisms, right? And so I wonder about for us, what it means and what would it take for individuals to get to that courageously vulnerable place where they can be vulnerable, to have curious exploratory conversations with one another, and suspend in some ways, and in some ways suspended their certainty of how things should actually function, right? And that gets to be very scary because it gets to this unknown place. And for people who may just be a part of conversations about possibilities and opportunities, that may also seem like, to Serrano's point about identity, like, well, now what then am I supposed to be, right? And perhaps in some ways, I think that it's very convoluted and it's very gray, and I don't think we are supposed to be arriving at something, but yet we are supposed to be arriving at something at the same time too, right? And it's complex, and it's meant to be complex, I think. And yet, vulnerability is a place that I think I have seen a lot of men folks and masculine folks struggle with in their lives, even in these kinds of conversations, right? To Serrano's point earlier about having conversations about sex not enough, right? And that there isn't enough, which is very true, because people and men aren't willing to ask the question to each other of like, how did you actually experience sex, right? And sex in the vast and then the most expansive form, not just sex with regards to the genitals touching one another, right? But like, did you enjoy it and did you like it? Like that question alone, asking other men about that is like not invisible, or not there ever, right? And the question we are easily able to ask is, how many times did you score? Right? Especially as high school boys, how many times did you score? That we would be willing to ask. But to ask the question of how did you actually feel in the act of intimacy and love, how are you feeling in that? And how are you experiencing that? Getting to ask those kinds of questions is like, we just don't talk about that.
You said a lot of powerful stuff going on there. Thank you for that. And it was weird because when you said where do we arrive, I'm like, I arrive at me. And I think like, and not that ass, because I think like as I'm getting older, like I'm noticing that like the shit that we deem to be cliche are really real, and the shit that we don't actually live up to, like kids are our future, you know, the whole shit that we be like, oh, that's just a cliche. Like, no, that's actually real though. Like being yourself, like I don't know how much more, like I think I'm gonna just die preaching identity, to be honest with you, and I'm cool with that. But that's the only way that I know, like it's just being you, right? Like, so I guess, can y'all three do me a favor and put up one finger for me real quick? Okay. So put your finger down if you were raised in the projects or the hood before. So put your finger down now if you were raised without a father figure. So put your finger down now if you got stitches when you were 12 years old. So, and I guess, so I messed up, but so the premise of it was to be that, that you would be having your finger up because nobody actually endures the same life experiences as somebody else, right? And I actually believe that, right? I believe that there's nobody else who's like actually 26 at the moment, heterosexual, has tattoos, 6 foot, plays basketball, plays video games, listens to music, sings, dances, sings in and that's what I think identity is like we think about it so like it really is like a difference and a comparison at the same time. But it truly is like who we are. So when you like ask that, like, where do we arrive? I'm like, I arrive at me. Like nobody else I know do the shit that I do. They really don't. But you only find that when you dive deep into that part of your identity. Like I had to dive deep and be like, no, I could have tattoos and still love my mom, or I could have tattoos and still go to concerts where the singers are women. Like I could still work out and, you know, have women lead the things in my life. I had to figure it out through my identity. Like it didn't make me less of a person at all. So that game, I wish we could do like a world game to where we all like listed the shit that of like who we are, because I truly believe that a lot of like all of us will be like by ourselves because we are molded to be one. But I think like if that's all understood, I think that's again one of those things that we say that's cliche, like being you is a cliche, blah. But it really is though, like it really is real, like, you know, like nobody else I know has lost their grandmother at 22, and I had to like learn to do things that shaped my identity around that. But it took me to be honest about the shit. So that was one part of it. Another part was like just a safe space for people to have that vulnerability. Like it's one of those, I can't be a bully to people who don't know either, right? Because like, you know, having that safe space to have that vulnerability is the biggest part. Some of us have created it in our own, and that's some superhero shit, don't get me wrong. But a lot of us have not gotten a chance. Like I see a lot of my friends like just now have a space in their 20s, 30s, 40s of I could talk about this shit freely and you're not gonna judge me. You sure? Like I could do that? And I'd be like, yeah, I'm just sitting. Y'all know me sitting there smiling, like, go ahead, yeah, talk about it. So as much as I want to be like people don't know, like it's definitely that safe space to be yourself too, like that safe space to be vulnerable. I don't think that there's a lot of places like that for men, right? You know, if a male cries, the first thing somebody else is gonna say is stop acting like the bee or stop doing these things. So there's a lot more that you would have to do as far as like yourself too. I'm not definitely giving them an out. But I know like in terms of vulnerability, you definitely need that space to kind of start it up. Like, because I know a lot of my friends, like I'm that space. Like I see a lot of friends who are just now starting to be open about who they are and things that bother them, or even cry like for the first few times in their lives. So I could definitely notice that there's not a big amount of safe spaces for men to be, i.e. vulnerable, or to be vulnerable and like kind of go off of each other. But I also think that we can create those, because vulnerability, I don't know, it's kind of like a pull and tug with me. Like I go against like responsibility of you can be, but also like, you know, if you don't have that space, how can you be, if that makes sense?
I think the places where men are vulnerable, or where I should say, sort of society has said men can be vulnerable, are some really toxic places. You know, I would suggest, you know, fishing trip. I would suggest, you know, lodges, you know, places where, you know, men are sent. Really, I think to get socialized. But we're told that it's a space to be vulnerable, right? Or I'd rather not a place to be vulnerable. I should say a healthy place to be, right? We'd rather you be in one of these clubs. I think that the one thing that we can do is really think about, in terms of creating a place where men can be vulnerable around us, right? Is to really think about the way in which we respond with a question. Because I think we're kind of trying to unearth or have people look at layers. And I think you need to be really mindful of it, of how you do that. Or I think I like Serrano's piece about, yeah, just talk about it. I think that there's something in that helps people find their own way to be vulnerable in that space. But I do think that our nonverbal signals are, people pick up on those so readily. So if I say to you, go ahead and talk about it, then I think that you're going to be looking at me like, I'm going to reveal this, but the first cue you get from me non-verbally that I think what you're saying is BS or that you're weak, the first signal that I send you that, it's done. Because you're like, you said talk to you, you said I could talk to you, but that micro thing that you sent me, right, it was like, oh, nope, can't really talk about it. And so I will circumvent what I was going to share with you, and may not share ever again.
I'll try to be brief. I want to talk about vulnerability and identity. But for a long time, when I thought about vulnerability, I just inherently thought about softness, and I evaluated softness as negative, right? I've since expanded my notion of what it means and looks like to be vulnerable, and sometimes it means you're feeling a little emotionally sensitive and you don't want to be hurt that way. Sometimes it means when you open yourself up enough to be vulnerable, it might mean you're in physical danger, right? I want to acknowledge the breadth of what vulnerability means to men of various experiences and situations. There's actually a woman who helped me. I wrote an essay once. I read it at a conference about having called out a guy that I would have called a friend for a long time about using violence against his wife. And it included a really tense interaction between me and him. And she said, I've spent a lot of time telling men in classes I teach that they need to be vulnerable. They need to call out men who are being abusive. And I never stopped to realize what kind of actual danger that could put them in. And that ties into identity, because all that shit gets policed. There are complex, sometimes obvious, sometimes really subtle systems of policing, like Roderic was talking about, little tells. Sometimes it's a little tell, sometimes it's, just really trying to destroy a person who had the courage to say, I feel this thing, or I don't agree with that thing, or hey, and that identity stuff is, I'm thinking of specific uncles I have who think the whole concept of quote unquote identity politics or identity is, they just don't have any time for it. They think, my understanding, I'm not inside their brains, but my understanding is what they think is, I don't care how someone identifies. That's bullshit. You are who you are. I am who I am. And then they'll list all these aspects of their identities, right? I'm an American, I'm a veteran, I'm a gun owner, I'm white and I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm this. And a lot of those things don't, until they try to weaponize them, they're not inherently bad or good things, right? You can be all those things and still be a human being that doesn't encroach on other human beings. But my understanding of them and people who have similar ways of thinking is that those are things I am. It's not what I identify as, it's what I am. And I've got all these weirdos out here telling me how they identify, but I know who they actually are, so I'm not going to respect them when they tell me how they identify. And they are steady talking about identity the whole time. The whole conversation is about identity. They just don't see themselves as having identity or being driven by a sense of identity. And it's another one of those things that I'm like, oh, well, that's hurting people, right? You don't realize it. That's not hurting, but that's hurting people. And I also think you have, like, there's something in there that's just, what is it that you are scared of needing to acknowledge? That all those things you see in yourself are not as concrete and immutable as you think they are, that there is like some fluidity there. And it also gets into these, ideas about what it means to be, at a conversation about toxic masculinity a couple weeks ago, and was trying to help someone see, like, I know cis hetero men who are veterans, who are gun owners, who drive big trucks, who spend a lot of time in the woods, who run trap lines, and their embodiment of who they are has nothing to do with dominance over any fellow human being. And no one has ever asked them to not be who they are. But again, that those concepts of identity and vulnerability play so strongly into what it means to, yeah. So we got 4 minutes left according to my clock. I definitely don't want to take the last word, and I was hoping to just like make things way more complicated. And then,
No, appreciating that, Chris, and appreciating Roderic and Serrano as always for this really, I think, deep and meaningful conversation that got to some point, I think, for me about like where the tension places might be and how we navigate that as men in striving to be healthy for ourselves, not only ourselves as individuals, but in community with other people, and being thoughtful and being considerate, and be thinking about the impact that we actually make in community at the same time too, right? Because it's not just about, oh, I don't do those things, or I don't act that way, therefore I don't have to participate in those things. But I think the constant evaluation of our actions and who we are is critical to what it means to be healthy, right? And I don't think that healthy is really necessarily arriving at some certain place, but I believe more so now than ever that it is about a striving. It is about a movement place. And even when we think about therapy, it is about making movements as well too. At least that's been my approach, is like, am I making some kind of a movement towards whatever trajectory? I'm not sure yet, but is there a shift somewhere that's actually happening, right? Or something that's unloosening itself up to allow for some other emergence to actually happen. So I will end there in terms of my thoughts, and really appreciating again for those of you who are joining us on Facebook at this moment or later on via YouTube. Definitely give us your thoughts and comments. Where do you see yourself in this conversation? What's resonating? What's not? How are you picking up from this conversation and moving it forward with the men in your lives and the masculine folks in your lives? And we're always here to engage with all of you, and we'll continue engaging. And again, this is our 24th Kitchen Table Conversation series, and we'll continue these series, and looking forward to more engagement and other folks joining us as well too. We put out a lot of open invitations, and if you're one of them and you're like, hey, I want to be a part of these conversations, we definitely invite you onto the live screen to be a star with us, quote unquote, in the moment as well too, to hear what you're thinking and what you want to share. That said, we always want to thank our philanthropy partners, Blue Cross Blue Shield and the Novo Foundation, for their generous support, for allowing us to continue these conversations and continue the work that we are doing in community in terms of building spaces and engaging men and masculine folks towards the goal of ending gender-based violence throughout the state. So until next time, we will see all of you in about 2 weeks or so. Have a really great one.